Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about game flavor. And I'm deliberately doing this on a Friday fun day because what I'm going to talk about is very subjective. So kind of view this as a Tim talks about game development at another very high level of description. And I almost didn't do this video because what I mean by game flavor is really hard to describe. I'm going to try to do it, but it's hard. If you watched my video last week on high level design direction, there's bits and pieces of that in that video, but game flavor is a very subjective thing, and it's really hard to get anything subjective across when you're talking about it. Trust me, if you watch my video on bad games, where I say there really are no bad games or any bad games for you, and then read the comments and watch people just do mental gymnastics and backflips to try to prove that there are bad games, and forgetting that I said that there are bad games for you. But you can't declare a game bad for everyone. Here, I've proved it. Here's my proof. And they throw out things like, well, what about a game that crashes a lot? You mean like mine? Or they throw out games that aren't completed, which I've played tons of really excellent games that really never were finished. The end of it is it just falls off. So I'm not going to repeat all that. I'm just going to say what I'm saying here is kind of subjective. Now, it's hard to define flavor, but let me make it clear that flavor isn't game vision. Game vision is the director holds in their head and tries to express through all their design docs, especially through all the pillars, how the game will be played and what it will feel like and what you do when you're playing it. To give you an example of this is Arcanum and Fallout had very different visions, but very similar flavor. I think a lot of people, once they played Arcanum, they found out it was made by the people who made Fallout, went, oh, yeah, yeah. A lot of my games have a Tim Kaine flavor to them, and people have said that. It's not part of their vision. It's also not part of the qualia. Qualia is even harder to define. Qualia is that ineffable quality of experience something. It's often described as, when you see the color red, that's the qualia of red. When you taste an apple, that's the qualia of the apple. You can write books about the color red. You can scientifically describe what the flavor compounds are in an apple, but that is not the same as the qualia of actually experiencing it. To put it again, flavor isn't qualia because Fallout 1 and Fallout New Vegas have very different qualia. The experience of those two games are wildly different. I mean, one's isometric and the other is first person. One's turn-based, one's real-time. But they have very similar flavor. There's a reason I put Fallout New Vegas in my masterclass video. So, I think it's important that your game have a defined flavor. And this is something the game director has to do. And let me just warn you right now that if you don't want to do that, if you consciously choose not to decide on a flavor consciously and express it to the team making it, you've still made a decision about the flavor. I mean, just listen.
If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice.
Listen to Geddy Lee. He was right. There's a lot of jokes about trying to make things inoffensive and think about everybody who might be upset about something you do in your game. And I think the problem with this is this leads to people consciously choosing unflavored, making that their choices. I'm going to make this game unflavored. Kind of like Maud Flanders.
You gloomy gusses, who's up for a big bowl of non-fat ice milk?
I want wintergreen! Unflavored for me.
I love that scene. Let me just warn you that if you try to avoid offense in order to get broader appeal, your game will probably come across as exceptionally boring. I'm sure you've all played very plain, vanilla, fantasy video games or tabletop games that just don't seem to have anything going for them. In fact, I will warn you now that if you plan to become a game director and your idea of how to be a game director is to compulsively filter yourself, then maybe you need to watch Community and see the scene where Abed comments on Britta.
I'm really glad you said that, Brito. The idea that you compulsively filter yourself makes your like a flavor kind of a flavor.
Listen to Abed. Abed spits truth. So, I'm just telling you that as a director, as someone who's directed several games, I'm just telling you as a director, you do need to pick a flavor. If you do not, your game will be boring and vacuous and unmemorable. Now, it's possible to make a flavored game that's all of those, but I guarantee you, if you try to go with no flavor, you're guaranteeing it. You're putting the stamp of boring right on your game. So, let's say you're with me so far, and you're like, yep, gotta have a flavor. Yep, it's not Division, it's not the Qualia, it's its own kind of like vibe. You then need to enforce this. And this is why it's so incredibly hard. Go back and watch, and I'll link all the videos I'm mentioning, I'll link below. Watch my game director videos, especially the one where I talk about game directors and their ego. Because people will accuse you at some point of being a dictator because you're throwing out work that is good. And I've talked about this. The hardest work to throw out of your game isn't the work that's bad. Usually when work is bad, you can point out to someone, hey, this isn't written well. The character's not coming across. It's very, aggressive and negative, and that's not what we wanted. It's much harder to throw out really good quality work that just doesn't match the flavor of the game. And since the flavor is hard to express to someone when you're making the game, before the game is done, it's hard for people to see the flavor. It's why many of my games, I've talked about this with Fallout, I think it happened with Arcanum. It certainly happened at the beginning of Outer Worlds. It was really hard to explain to people what the game was because there was no game yet. And it's a lot easier, I can tell you, like making a sequel. Now that I'm actually making a sequel with the Outer Worlds, it's easier to point to what the flavor is. So you can say, play the first game. There's the flavor. So that's something that you're going to have to figure out. Likewise, I'm never going to be able to tell you what your flavor is. You will have to figure that out. My games have a Tim Kaine flavor. Your games are going to have a you flavor. And that's why you have to be careful, because when you ask people to work on it, they're all going to bring their flavors. And it's going to be hard for you to keep your flavor distinct or the only one. Sometimes mixing a bunch of flavors together into a melange. Yes, I saw Dune, I read Dune, and I speak French a little bit. Sometimes melange works. Usually, though, if you've ever done cooking, you can't just throw a bunch of random spices in a dish and hope it works out. So, I can't tell you what your flavor is, but I can tell you, to extend that cooking analogy, what's a good recipe for you to figure out your flavor. If you've ever heard of the cooking method called salt, fat, acid, heat, try to follow that in your game. Salt makes flavor come out. It's an element you put in. Salt has its own flavor, but it also makes other flavors stronger. It's why people even salt salads and not just savory dishes. I put salt in my brownies because if you don't put it in there, the flavor doesn't come out. Just a little bit of salt. That's why sometimes they sprinkle salt on top of brownies. Brownies. Anyway, you need elements of the game that accentuate your flavor. They may not be the carrier of the flavor, but they make your flavor stand out. Similarly, fat. You put in fat in the dish because it carries the flavor. It doesn't accentuate it. It lets it spread out everywhere. In your game, what that means is you need to have that flavor in everything. You want your lore text to be flavored. You want your dialogues to be flavored. You want location names to be flavored. It's something that you have to think about. If you want this world to really express itself, how would people name where they live in this world? That's why there's a junk town in Fallout, but not in the Outer Worlds. And then there's a Roseway in Outer Worlds, but not in Fallout. That's important. Just like fat spreads the flavor everywhere out in your dish, you've got to do that in your game. Acid. In terms of game, I think acid is giving your player a little surprise, making them go, oh. It's especially true when you go, oh, you didn't realize that my flavor would lead to this. To me, I loved it because I think some of the acid in Fallout were those end slides when the game went, I was watching you. I saw what you did there. I saw that you were mean to the ghouls. I saw that you killed children. I saw that all these things happen. So those traits that got applied to you, like chem addict or child killer, or those slides that showed up at the end of the game, was the game's acid, just basically saying, hey, I explained the flavor to you. Why are you surprised? This is part of the flavor. And then finally, heat. Heat to me is just in the game putting some pressure on the player. Having tension, whether it's dramatic tension. I mean, that's what the timer was supposed to do in Fallout. It was supposed to add a little heat, a little pressure, a little tension to the player. You try to do that in the storyline. You know, hey, if you don't do this, all these people are going to die. Hey, if you don't do this, maybe your brain is going to deliquesce. You know, that was the original heat of Outer Worlds. You've got to put something in the game that adds some tension. And that can be part of your flavor. It doesn't have to be super hot. It just has to be there. So, God, I've talked a lot about food, but flavor is food. I hope this video will be something that will help you when you're actually making your game, when you're thinking about your vision, and you're thinking about design pillars, and you're thinking about how to be a director, and you're thinking of that qualia of what the player will experience when they're actually playing your game. You will also think, what's my flavor? What's my personal flavor, and how is it being expressed in this game I'm making? Hope this helps.